Northwest of downtown Miami, outside of Hialeah City Hall, is an overlooked memorial to 4 Cuban martyrs and patriots and to their organization, Brothers to the Rescue. To understand their story as some of the more recent victims of the Cuban regime, you must understand how their group was formed. In February 1991, American media began reporting the death of 15-year-old Gregorio Perez Ricardo, a rafter fleeing to America. He died not of drowning, but a slower, painful death of dehydration. Pictures of his open casket funeral enraged the Cuban community, who had mostly abandoned the radicalism of the 60s and 70s in fighting Cuban communism. In May of that year, Brothers to the Rescue was formed by Cuban exiles and their supporters, pilots whose mission was to fly over Florida Strait and drop water and supplies for stranded rafters and to call their position in to the U.S. Coast Guard. By late 1995, the leader of the group, Jose Basolto, was working creatively with the Florida Martin Luther King Institute in promoting nonviolence. It was a creative step for the exile community. This was all a nuisance to the Cuban government, but after a massacre committed against rafters on July 13, 1994, the Castro brothers put the organization in their sights. After this, the Cuban government proactively discouraged rafters. There is circumstantial evidence to say that many were actively killed. In any case, by August of 1995, the Hermanos stopped seeing rafters in the water and were forced to take more aggressive approaches that increased their media spotlight. Although this wasn't militant, they did fly over Cuba at times and at least once dropped leaflets. The Cuban government knew they had to act. And that's when Juan Pablo Roque, a Cuban spy, came along. Roque, one of the group's aviators, had been in America for 4 years. He'd convinced them of his loyalty, but in reality was a spy for the Cuban government and a former pilot for the Cuban Air Force. On February 23, 1996, he disappeared in his plane over the Florida Strait and reappeared after the shootdown in Havana to condemn the group. This led U.S. officials to later claim he was a spy all along, but Roque maintains that he was simply disillusioned and had caught winds of plans to attack military bases and introduce explosives to the island. If true, this would go entirely against the organization's MO. More strangely, the FBI was found to have met and paid Roque several times before he defected back to Cuba. The day after Roque's defection, 2 Brothers to the Rescue planes were shot down off the coast of Cuba. The 4 killed were Carlos Costa, Armando Alejandre Jr., Mario de la Peña, and Pablo Morales.
Blanca y azul la avioneta, está a baja altura, avioneta.
La tengo en captura, la tengo en captura.
La tenemos en captura, autorízanos. La tenemos en captura, autorízanos.
Debe ser la 337.
Esa. Es esa. Autorízanos, cojones. Autorízanos, cojones, que la tenemos. Autorizado a destruir 08. Primer disparo. ¡Le dimos, cojones! ¡Le dimos! ¡Le dimos!
¡Lo retiramos, cojones!
Espérate, para ver dónde cae.
¡Arte!
¡Cojones, le dimos! ¡Sigamos! Oye, marcaron el lugar.
Manuel Artime's story is symbolic of early Cuban militancy. The son of a poet, himself a doctor hoping to become a psychologist, he joined forces with Castro in 1957 to fight against the dictator Batista. With the success of the revolution, he was appointed to second in command of the agricultural reform in Cerro Redondo. There he met the local Minister of Agriculture, Major Humberto Soria Marin, and Rogelio Gonzalez Corzo, the Director of Agriculture. The 3 formed the Rural Commandos, a kind of Peace Corps for young people who seemingly supported Castro, but who were mostly recruited from Catholic schools around Havana. A year later, some members of the Rural Commandos, already fearful for their lives and exiled to Mexico, Artime founded the Movement to Recover the Revolution, now an openly anti-Castro resistance group. In October of that year, Commander Huber Matos was captured and tried by the revolutionary government, after which the regime began to root out other opposition groups. By December 1959, Manuel Artime had contacted the CIA at the U.S. Embassy in Havana, who arranged his escape on a Honduran freighter. From his base in Miami, Artime received support in the form of arms drops from the CIA, who aided his MRR cells in Cuba. This was all leading up to an invasion, and everybody knew it. From that point on, his movements were all over the US and South America until he and the 1,300-strong Brigade 2506 landed at the Bay of Pigs. It was April 17, 1961. They had been promised support of airdrops and supplies, and possibly U.S. Marines directly landing on their beachhead. This support never came, and it dawned on them that the U.S. had stabbed them in the backs. 2 days later, Artime was captured by the Cuban military. The Cuban government began executing many members of the captured brigade, but understood that releasing Artime unharmed would be a propaganda victory. From 1962 forward, Artime would be a crucial asset to the CIA. He participated in Project Amworld, a CIA plan that set up Cuban camps in Costa Rica and Nicaragua, which would raid the island. After JFK was assassinated, President Johnson shut the program down. Artime's future endeavors included attempts to kill Fidel Castro and free the veterans of Watergate, many of them themselves veterans of the Bay of Pigs. His premature death in 1977 from cancer sparked conspiracies in both Miami and Havana. Artime knew a lot, perhaps too much. He was likely planning to put Johnson on blast for betraying them a second time, with the betrayal of Project Amworld. Artime was a problem for Washington, D.C. U.S. intelligence wanted the Cubans to operate behind the scenes, but when their giving well ran dry, Artime began to work with whomever and whatever he had. This was the point at which Cuban exile communities moved from directly tied to the CIA to a chaotic, uncontrollable state that made bureaucrats nervous. And by the time of Artime's death, Alpha 66 was a major player in Cuban exile politics. Much debate exists around the group's formation. If anyone is a member of any of these groups, please reach out to me in the comments, but as far as I can tell, it was organized in the early 1960s, roughly around the time of the failed invasion. A 1964 FBI memo states that the three founding members were assets of U.S. Army intelligence. Again, however, the U.S. had trouble with these groups. Alpha 66, Omega 7, and similar paramilitaries were all financed early on by the CIA. However, as U.S. foreign policy shifted towards dialogue, Alphas would commit drive-by attacks on Cuban military posts and against tourist infrastructure, claiming responsibility for direct action as recently as 1995. Because this was all done without approval of their CIA handlers, the group split many times over. Those in favor of dialogue usually left, many in the radical camp became more bold, and some even broke off to found groups like Commandos F4. More on them later. Andre Nazario Sargent. In an article from 1991, Andre Sargent, the group's leader, claimed that the rebels in Alpha 66 had tried to assassinate Fidel Castro 4 times, had conducted 25 raids against the Cuban military, and had infiltrated 18 undercover Cuban operatives. They transmitted dissident broadcasts to the island with World War II radios advising on sabotage and direct resistance. And with the gradual fading away of radical groups like Alpha 66, smaller groups have attempted to take their place. Commandos F4, formed by Rodolfo Frometa, is one of these. According to Cuban government sources, Rodolfo split away from Alpha's leadership in 1994 and tried to promote their plans of a direct incursion into the island. Many of their members were recruited from the rafters in the crisis of 94. In February of the same year, Frometa and 7 others of Alpha 66 were arrested on their way to Cuba. 50 rifles and 26,000 rounds of ammunition were seized, and the 8 men were soon released. In June of that year, he and another head of the group were interrogated for attempting to acquire Stinger missiles. This, again, is according to the Cuban government and must be taken with a grain of salt. Their relations with Alpha 66 could not have been that bad considering their offices were just down the road on the second floor of this old complex. The old disused print shop a few blocks away that housed Alpha 66 has since been bulldozed, the end of an era. Mr. Frometa, if you or any of your friends would be willing to do an interview, I'd drop everything to fly out and speak with you. The same goes for any member of one of these patriot militias. And this is the end of an era. The old 714 West Flagler Street office of Alpha 66 was at one point in this field. At the Woodlawn North Cemetery in Miami, you have a collection of graves that speak to the lives and deaths of Cuban exiles in South Florida. The first is none other than a Cuban president, Carlos Prio. Interestingly and sadly, he was the first president of Cuba, born in an independent Cuban state, and the last to be elected democratically. He served from 1948 to 1952 when he was deposed by Batista in a military coup. Historian Charles Ameringer summarizes the presidency of Prio and fellow party member Grau as follows. These years were a time of constitutional order and political freedom. They were not golden years by any means, but in 2 elections, Cubans had the opportunity to express their desire for a rule of civil liberties, primacy of Cuban culture, and achievement of economic independence. Prio was called the civil president. Cuba saw a civility it had never known, but there was also a degree of self-enrichment from corrupt politicians who knew that this peace would never last. Batista staged a coup in 1952, and Prio failed to mount any resistance. He flew to America and remarked, "They say that I was a terrible president of Cuba. That may be true, but I was the best president Cuba ever had." Prio supported Castro initially financially because in the early days of the revolution he claimed to only be allied against Batista. When it became obvious that Castro was a communist, the Prio family fled again to Miami, and in 1977 he shot himself in the chest. Many questions surround his suicide. Rumors abound. He was said to have supported the Bay of Pigs financially and was a property developer in Miami linked to Jack Ruby and Frank Sturgis by rumors. He was summoned for questioning by the Select Committee on Assassinations for any info he might have had about JFK's murder and shot himself days later on April 5th. This was a week after George de Morschild and Charles Nicoletti had similarly died very mysteriously. A stone's throw away from President Prio is Jorge Mas Canosa, one of the most popular Cuban exiles in South Florida and an influential Cuban lobbyist. In 1960, he came to America penniless as a refugee, but became a success story for his community. He founded Mostec and with his wealth created the lobbying group Cuban American National Foundation. Canosa was commissioned as a second lieutenant for the Bay of Pigs, but his boat was held offshore and he eventually returned to America after a brief stint in the U.S. Army. But his lobbying in America is marked as a sort of middleman between revolutionaries and businessmen. The info we have on this activity comes from his brother Ricardo, who claims that he was in a CIA-backed Cuban exile representation group. This group's military arm, CORU, was composed of 20 elite men, the likes of Luis Posada Carrilles and Orlando Bosch. Canosa remained the face of respectable Cubans, but came to the aid of Carrilles, or Commander Bambi, in 1985. Posada claimed in interviews that Canosa financed his escape from a Venezuelan maximum security prison for being the intellectual mastermind of the downing of Flight 455, which killed 73 people. Bambi, and likely Canosa, considered this downing a militant success. It demoralized Cuba by wiping out their entire fencing team, as well as a few minor government officials and 5 North Koreans. Also in this cemetery is a memorial to the unknown fighter in the Bay of Pigs, whose remains were repatriated by Cuba after he died. Across town is the grave of Orlando Bosch, overlooking the founder of Alpha 66. The common theme in exile politics is that the revolution was betrayed by Fidel Castro. In fact, the anthem of Alpha 66 makes direct reference to this. No person epitomizes this idea better than Bosch. He attended the University of Havana and befriended Castro personally, and acted as the president of the school's medical body. His friend Fidel filled the same role for the law students. According to Castro himself, the two often smoked cigars and planned direct actions against Batista's regime when Bosch wasn't vaccinating children for polio in the Santa Clara province. He left Cuba in the 1960s after failing in his attempt to depose his former friend in the Escambre Rebellion, worthy of a video all its own. When Bosch arrived to Miami, he gathered men together who formed the Insurrectionary Movement for Revolutionary Recovery, which bombed 11 sugar mills and military posts along the coast. Initially, the CIA helped get him safe houses and infiltration teams within the island, but when he requested airstrikes, the agency rebuked him. All the while, he was a hospital director in Florida, but was soon fired when an explosives cache was actually found on hospital property. In diving back into Cuban history, and the Mount Nebo Cemetery is the grave of another man who left an indelible mark on the past of the island. In the past, I've done videos about the Traficante family, and the Lanskys are in a similar boat. When Batista came to power, Miami and Tampa businessmen began to open up casinos in Havana. There, Cuban authorities would ignore corruption and murder if they got a cut. The first order of business for Castro was to shutter these clubs, and that cut into the profits of the Jewish mafia under Lansky and the Italian mob under the Traficantes. In Cuba, he was worth about $166 million in today's currency. At the time of his death, his estate was worth less than $170,000. In World War II, Mayor Lansky's network broke with their more criminal enterprise to pursue more wholesome activities. These included beating the hell out of German-American Bund members and breaking up pro-Hitler rallies. He contracted out of the Office of Naval Intelligence for Operation Underworld, which would keep a watch out for saboteurs and provide security for U.S. harbors. Imagine that. Jewish and Italian mobsters protecting GIs from Nazis on the docks of New York and Florida. It was there that his ties to intelligence were formed. After the war, he was deported to Sicily, but secretly moved to Cuba, where he took control of the mafia's operations. He personally befriended Batista, who granted Lansky total control of all casinos and racetracks in his country. In 1946, mobsters met at the Hotel Nacional for an actual conference of the underworld. Present were Cuban politicians and military figures: Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, Joey Bananas, Vito Genovese, Santo Traficante Jr., Carlos Marcello, and dozens of other crime figures. Remember how President Priaulx offered no real resistance to the military coup of Batista? This is because Mayor Lansky offered him a bribe of $250,000, worth millions nowadays. Eventually, Mayor Lansky was ousted and fled to Miami, and actually lived very close to Priaulx, who must have felt great regret at having taken his bribe. His enemy list only grew. In the 1970s, Lansky retired to Miami and lived quietly. And not far from Orlando Bosch's grave, the grave of Sarjan, and presumably the unmarked grave of Posada Carrilles, is a monument for Enrique Bermudez. Nicaragua, in the latter part of the Cold War, had been won by the communist Sandinistas, who had support from Cuba and the Soviet Union. Bermudez was a leader of the Contras, a loose paramilitary opposing the Marxist regime from the very beginning of the conflict in 1979 until his 1991 assassination. As their top commander, he had a say in all of their operations. He came from humble beginnings, the son of a personal servant and an engineer, but rose to the ranks of a lieutenant colonel in the pro-Western government's National Guard. While serving as a military attaché in the U.S., the government fell to the Sandinistas, and he returned to wage a war against the communists. His Contras were using hit-and-run tactics and operating from deep in the jungles. These militias coalesced into the Nicaragua Democratic Force, a political umbrella representing the militias, which were in many cases a loose confederation of defected army units. Bermudez provided stability in all this chaos, but also caused a rift. Ultimately, much of the resistance was from farmers, but Bermudez was giving positions to ex-guardsmen and Miami-backed exiles over more capable commanders. He was eventually ousted by a Nicaraguan rebel leadership movement and held a more background role, helping the Contras transition to a political opposition party. In 1984, elections were held in Nicaragua. Daniel Ortega and the Sandinistas won this election, but observers remarked that there was widespread corruption. Because of this, a democratic coalition defeated the Sandinistas in 1990. Bermudez returned to Managua and was lured to a meeting at the Intercontinental Hotel and was gunned down in early 1991. His murder remains unsolved. And in the same cemetery as Enrique Bermudez, you have the grave of Valerie Hart, who led a similar, now-forgotten, indigenous separatist revolt in Guyana. She was a politician with United Force, a center-right political party, and owned a ranch with her husband at Mereru. She and her husband were present at a conference of Amerindians in 1968, the Kabakaburi Congress, which represented the demands of 40,000 indigenous peoples to the Guyanese government of Prime Minister Forbes Burnham. Burnham was a Champagne socialist strongman who embraced Afrocentrism, as Afro-Indians were a large population of the new republic. However, the American Indians felt sidelined by a socialist who divided land to his supporters to the southwest of the country, and independent rebellions began forming. Venezuela under Raul Leone was conservative and, like the Venezuela of today, contested the border, claiming the entire western half of Guyana. When the agriculture minister of Guyana, Robert Jordan, openly stated that indigenous ownership of the land would be ignored and that African Americans would be shipped to those regions, a popular uprising began. Hart was then appointed the president of the provisional government of Rupununi. The leaders of the rebellion, including the Hart family, offered Venezuela control of the disputed territory of Guyana Escobia in exchange for their support. The war began January 2, 1969, as rebels attacked a police station in Lethem. 5 officers and 2 civilians were killed as indigenous people fanned through the town and destroyed government buildings with rocket fire. Rebels began attacking airfields in an attempt to delay the arrival of the Guyanese forces. The GDF arrived at an airstrip 6 miles north of town and marched in, while the indigenous people quickly scattered, hearing reports of widespread atrocities. The following day, Venezuelan military officers opened airfields to the far east of their country, urging the Amerindians to flee as refugees and offering to take in the leaders of the revolution. Hart and other leaders accepted Venezuelan citizenship because Venezuela recognized that territory as theirs. Overall, less than 10 Guyanese personnel were killed, while hundreds of rebels died. Valerie Hart lived in exile in Miami, where she died in 2021. It's a sad fact of the Cold War that the Rupununi uprising is forgotten by modern historians.